This is a test. This station is conducting a test of the emergency broadcast system. This is only a test.
Hello, Good News Nation. The good news is back after a small hiatus, and we are glad to be back. I am your co-host, Kara Hayes, and joined as always with the Reverend Doctor.
How's it going?
It is going.
There's been a lot that's gone on since our last show.
Yes.
I'm going to start off by saying rest in peace, Ross Perot.
Yes, that was sad. I remember him as from growing up.
Well, everybody does. Like, okay, he ran in 1992. That was his big claim to fame right there. But he ran again in 96, but that was a little bit less memorable that time around. But what do you remember most about him? Because me personally, I remember him as being like, he was so out of place in the 92 election. Like, he was this true American statesman almost when you go back and look at it, like the last true one we had run for president, like in that old school make or model.
Yeah.
I guess, because I went back and looked at a couple of videos when I found out he died, of him on stage debating. And he had George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton surrounding him on both sides. And when he starts talking, instead of really replying honestly or having any kind of intellectual honesty to their rebuttals to him, they just kind of sit and smirk. And it's like, you know that they're both thinking he's not part of the club.
Very, very much so. Very much so. I always liked him, partially because he kind of seemed like everybody's grandpa.
I know, he really did.
He just seemed like, hey, I'm this normal guy. I mean, he had money, that kind of goes without saying. But he just came across as this pure-ish American, I want to see my country succeed, and here's how we can do it.
He definitely was way past his time, and that's unfortunate, because he's a man who could never be a president in the media age. In the age of television.
Yes.
It's like the video killed the radio star thing with music. Like, you get exactly what I mean by that, and I think everybody listening knows what I mean by that.
Yeah, I think so too. I think so too.
So what else? Okay, a big one we need to go into is, even though this has been an ongoing issue for a while now, ever since our last show, there was the sentencing of the NXIVM members.
Yes.
So go into that for just a little bit.
So I've not really kept up on the whole trial as far as what's been going on.
I haven't kept up during the trial phase, but leading up to it, I mean, this was a subject I went all in on.
Yeah.
For a long, long time there. And the thing that's interesting to me is that the media has taken so much care in presenting this as... In presenting NXIVM as this group of ragtag eccentrics, I guess. I mean, I know that there's a cultish vibe to it, but they kind of make it seem like, okay, these are all consenting adults who just, were into some kind of kinky sex, like weird stuff. But when you really, read the charges and what was going on against them, there's legit sex trafficking.
Oh, yeah.
They had women from Mexico who they were keeping branded, confined in rooms for years at a time, that they were selling, pimping out to the elite.
Yeah, which, some people, I am aware, don't believe there is sex trafficking going on to the extent that it gets talked about or doesn't get talked about. But it's a real thing. I mean, it's scary.
Well, there was an FBI statistic that I read probably about 2-3 years ago, that the one that's always interested me is they say that from the last year that they took actual numbers on this, or what their estimates are anyway, they believe that there's now, at this point, more slaves within the boundaries of the United States than there were at any time since before 1865.
What?
Yeah, no shit.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
That's really terrifying.
Yeah. No, it's a real legit industry. I mean, not a legit industry, but it's an industry.
Yeah, wow. That's...
And to me, when I looked at the Nexium case, it seems clear to me what's going on is that, you know, the guy at the very top of the pyramid, Keith Raniere, in this case, was a pimp. That Allison Mack and these, you know, Hollywood actresses that he had working for him were handlers.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they were being bankrolled by the Seagram's fortune, by a woman who's also a Rothschild by blood. And they had, like I said, women from south of the border who had been branded and were being sold to the elite. I mean, it's a sex trafficking ring. It's not what the media has tried to make it presented as, because I think if they were completely honest about it, it would raise way too many questions about other people.
Agreed. And, you know, it reminds me, I'm trying to remember exactly, but there was, I think it was maybe back in the 80s or the 90s, there was the accusation that, like, President Bush and, you know, all of these, like, elites and rich people, where they were getting young, well, I say young boys because that's the case that I remember. But
there's
there's
a documentary about it on YouTube that they had originally filmed for A&E, but it was pulled from the network. But it was called The Boy Business, if I remember it right.
Oh.
And no, I know exactly what you're talking about. It goes all into it. I mean, this is a subject that goes way, way, way back.
Yeah, and it doesn't get it doesn't get the coverage that it should.
Right.
Because you can't call out, you know, presidents and former presidents and, you know, the big business people. Oh no, we have to protect them.
Yeah, and I mean, a way I've always thought of it is that, you know, when we were doing the show on the Satanic Panic, how it's one of the biggest dirty secrets of, you know, not just small towns, but anywhere. It's pedophilia is something that we all understand it goes on in every city in the country.
Yep.
On every street, usually in the country, it's there.
Yep.
It's present in some way. But we want to, like, have this distance with thinking about our leaders or the people we watch on television.
Yes,
but it's
they're
it's
above
true.
that.
Yeah.
Yes.
But it's absolutely true.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I think sometimes we fail to realize that our presidents and our movie stars and directors and whatevers, they are just people.
Yeah.
They just happen to be in the public eye. There's just as much incidence of, you know, wicked people, and probably, to me, I think even more so, because they have the means and the opportunity to get whatever it is that they want.
Do you think of it sort of like the Vatican? And well, Hollywood and Washington, for example. I'll tell you what I mean by that. Is that, you know, we rip on the Vatican a lot, but, you know, at the same time, we on some level understand that, yeah, not all Catholic priests molest children.
Yes.
But there's enough who do in high places to where ones who don't realize there's an enforced code of silence. Mm-hmm. Where anytime, if anyone who was, you know, good at heart and, like, honest wanted to come in and shake things up, they can't. Because, you know, there's an implicit, we have more than one way of getting rid of you or sweeping this under the rug.
Yeah, and I have to say, I mean, that's a pretty good analogy, because it's this enclave of we're gonna keep your little secret,
right?
And, you know, and like you said, they have ways of dealing with people who try to whistleblow.
Well, all groups are like that with their internal dynamic. I mean, police departments are like that when it comes to sweeping up crimes that go on within it, because you're inside or you're outside.
Yeah, us versus them.
Yeah. So, coming in from Nexium, we've naturally got the one that's occupied everybody at social media for the last week, Jeffrey Epstein.
Oh, man.
This is one I didn't think was ever going to happen, to be honest.
You know, realizing that this is basically, I mean, this is a decade old or more information.
Yeah.
You know, and they're finally, you know, they're finally bringing charges against him. I have to hope that, you know, they are on the up and up. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't just like, okay, well, you know, we're not going to prosecute you for this because you can do this, you know. But I'm really glad that they're getting this scumbag. Cause,
Well, back in 2006, he was given a sweetheart deal.
Yes.
Where he was allowed to serve like 18 months.
13 months.
Yeah, I think he was sentenced
great.
to 18, but he only served 13, and it was under house arrest.
Yeah, it was 6 days a week he was able to go out of the prison.
To his office, that's right.
Yes, to work.
Okay.
Oh gosh, that sounds so horrible.
Well, and it seems like the way that the media has really covered this, since this started, is they don't want to address the issue in and of itself. They either want to tie Clinton to him or they want to tie Trump to him.
Mm-hmm.
And, I ended up thinking, like, why does this have to be a partisan thing?
Because everything's a partisan thing these days.
Well, I mean, I get that, but but
there are
it gives
other,
you a headache thinking about it.
It does, because to me those are the easy fish in a way, to sort of target, but it's so much more. It's beyond, a president or an ex-president. There are a lot of people who were involved with him. And
I think the average person really has no idea just how weird of shit the people they look up to or into. When it comes to the super rich and people who I don't even know the words I would use for it, but people who, when you make a certain amount of money and you're that far above the average person in the stratosphere, and you get to the point where you're attending parties on, a billionaire's island,
mm-hmm.
and shit like that, I just think that the average person has no clue that the people they vote for, the people they watch on TV, what they're really into.
Mm-hmm. And
if they had any idea, they would probably freak out.
You're probably right. Because we tend to think of, oh, well, that's so and so, and they were in this movie and that movie, and we might see pictures of them on YouTube, or not YouTube, Instagram.
Yeah.
Oh, I saw them. They were blah blah blah. But we don't. There's 24 hours in a day,
mm-hmm.
and there are days when they don't post pictures or they go on vacation. You don't know what they're doing, and but we don't want to think about that because
mm-hmm.
it's. Well, but I like him as an actor. I like her as an actor.
Yeah.
There's more to it. There's more to their life that we don't know about.
Yeah,
than we do.
This arrest has the potential to go down as the biggest scandal in American history.
I kind of hope it does.
Yeah, it has the potential to. Now, whether they're going to fall through with it or not, I have no idea.
Yeah.
But the implications of it are so far-reaching.
Yes. It will really be interesting to see how this plays out and how far they do go down the rabbit hole.
Yeah.
I definitely am gonna keep more of an eye on this.
Well, where do you think it's going to end up?
Probably nowhere I want it to. Though sadly, and I hope I'm wrong, but it's probably going to be a case of a whole lot of jibber jabber, and he'll get a slap on the wrist and be out.
Well, here's a question, and this is one I've been thinking about a lot for the last 2 days or so. Is who do you think was bankrolling Epstein? Because when I look at the whole case, I mean, it seems pretty obvious to me, and I could be wrong about this one, but to me, it seems pretty obvious that his role, in air quotes, that he played was in being someone who provided blackmail
mm-hmm.
to another party. That what he did ultimately was now I'm not saying he was somebody who didn't indulge in this shit himself, because that's pretty obvious, but that what he was being paid for and bankrolled for, that it looks like, was he was someone who hung out with world leaders, with celebrities, and allowed them to indulge in whatever sick, depraved shit they wanted to.
Mm-hmm.
And that would be used as potential blackmail material in the future against him.
Mm-hmm.
But that begs the question: is who would he have been working for? The Rothschilds? Somebody higher than that?
Yeah.
I mean, it's a pretty deep question that I really don't know the answer to.
Yeah, and I don't know that we'll ever find out. My guess is that if anybody ever does, that will be kept under wraps.
Yeah.
You know, which is kind of a shame. But yeah, I mean, he kind of reminds me of like almost like from Hollywood, the Fixers back in like the 30s, 40s, all the way up to the 60s, I think.
Yeah, like the old school like mob role.
Yeah,
that was played.
yeah, where it was like, oh, okay, you know, yeah, I'll take you to go do this stuff and snap a few pictures. And oh, I'm sorry, did you want to say something? Remember this?
You know, that's what a lot of people thought about Hugh Hefner.
Really?
For years and years and years. No, people, there had always been not quite like a full-fledged conspiracy, but there's been a you know, like, I wonder if that's not what he does. He gets these people to party out at the mansion, you know, gets people, you know, you can follow this rabbit hole, right? Some, you know, ex-celebrity comes out to party, hang out at the mansion, you know, they get really drunk, get to indulge in whatever drug they want. There's some woman who's hitting on them. Then, you know, boom, find out, oh, hey, by the way, that girl, she was underage. But we got it, you know, we got it on video, but don't worry, just follow along with the plan, do what we want, and you're fine.
I mean, that's, if you think about it, it's relatively genius. It's disgusting, but it's kind of, you know, if you want people to do what you want and they wouldn't do it any other way.
Yeah.
That's a perfect way to get them to do what you want.
Well, I mean, if you go down that rabbit hole, like I said on YouTube, you'll find more than a few celebrities who all say that. They go, Hollywood's run on a blackmail system.
Mm-hmm. And I think it always has been. Really.
Oh, I'm sure.
You know.
I'm sure. Gosh, what else do we have? Oh, a point I didn't touch on with the NXIVM case. Have you seen this guy who's been making YouTubes about it ever since Keith Raniere's arrest? A guy named Ben Zemeckis.
No.
Look him up when you get a chance, and it's spelled SZEMKUS. He's a guy who, for anybody not familiar, one of the things that he talks about a lot is NXIVM's connections over the years, and he's been polygraphed, gone through lie detectors, and he's passed them all with flying colors, which is really interesting. But he talks about a mixer or a NXIVM party that he was at back in 2007, and he talks about some of the people who were there in attendance with him. He says, you know, not only did I meet Keith Raniere and Allison Mack, I also ran into Stormy Daniels.
Oh.
Which is, you know, interesting in and of itself, but also Anthony Weiner, Huma Abedin, Hillary Clinton, and a pretty big list of people.
Ooh.
So, just trust me.
Huh.
Next time you're reading about NXIVM, look this guy up.
Interesting. Yeah.
So this begs the natural question: is Stormy Daniels an MK Ultra robot?
Oh my. There would probably be weirder things that could happen.
There's almost nothing I could find out now about this crowd that would really shock me.
Yeah, it's getting that way. They're just, oh boy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So another big subject that I feel like we need to hit on for however long a time is the pending Iraq war. The pending Iran war.
Oh boy.
Yeah, because you know, what happened was there was a drone that was an American drone that was shot down over Iran. We were all ready to strike, to fire missiles, but supposedly at the last minute, 15 minutes before it was supposed to happen, Trump goes, what are the costs we can expect from this? How many casualties would we be looking at? And he was told somewhere in the realm of 150. And so he said, well, then it's not worth it. So that's happening. But, you know, for anybody who's been following everything going on in the Middle East for, you know, a very, very long time now, is Iran is the mother lode. Mm-hmm. They've really been after all along.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's the hotbed of the world's oil, and the idea ever since the days of Reagan, of a pro-America, secular Persian state has made Washington salivate for years and years. I mean, the idea of it has the potential to redraw the map of the Middle East as far as players who's allied with who, but potentially as far as geopolitics as well, because Russia and China are both allied with Iran, and this would change a lot of things if there was a regime change that went down.
Yeah. It almost makes me a little nervous. I mean, we've basically, officially, I guess, been out of the Cold War for 30, 40...
Almost 30 since 91.
91, okay, that's right. And, I'm really not eager to go back to that. I'm just, but this really, there's a lot of potential for some really bad shit.
Yeah.
And it bears keeping a closer eye on.
Well, Iran is such an interesting case. I mean, it's the most unique case, in my opinion, anywhere right now on the global stage, as far as any country goes. I don't know if you've ever heard this exact set of statistics before, but Iran has one of the biggest generation gaps of any country in the world, because they had so many people who died in the Iran-Iraq War. And essentially they have something coming close to 2 lost generations.
Whoa.
Where, the way it actually plays out on paper is that somewhere around 85% of the population is under age 40. And they say if you actually look at the demographic, and the other remaining 15% are old. And if you look at some of the other statistics that are going on with the country, when you really look at the youth, by all accounts of what's going on over there, is mosque attendance for Friday prayers in places like Tehran are below 1%, which makes it not... I believe they say that it makes it not just the least religiously observant of any Muslim country, but of any country in the world.
Wow.
And the youth, by all personal accounts, seem to be, highly secular, if not outright atheists. Like, they really don't want anything to do with the religion they were brought up with. Probably more capitalist than even most Americans are. And it seems to be a situation sort of similar to how China is now, where the government is awash in propaganda, but the young people sort of ignore it or laugh it off. They just look at it as a relic of their grandparents' time. Yeah. So the thing that happens, though, is there's a lot of geopolitical strategists who have been talking about what to do with Iran for a while now, saying, well, this seems like it's going to turn out in America's favor, that in the next 5 to 10 years you're going to have the old generation, or the Ayatollah's regime, dying off. And so anything that happens should happen organically, because if we go in there and start firing drones and fucking up like we tend to do, killing civilians, we're going to potentially turn all those people against us. But by that exact same hand, there's a lot of people in Washington, and way more so there's a lot of people in Israel, who say if they're going to fire a missile and hit Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, or New York City, it's going to be in the next 5 to 10 years. Because when you have a theocratic regime that knows its back is against the wall and that its days are numbered, that's when they're going to try to do shit. Wow. And the comparison, I've read a lot about this over the last couple months, but the comparison I keep seeing coming up over and over again when it comes to geopolitical theorists is they compare the situation in Iran right now with the state of the Soviet Union back in the late 1980s, probably circa 88 or 89, where one of the things that we discovered when the wall fell and we went into the Soviet Union is that outside of the ruling class, the top military brass and their families, there are almost no true communists, in air quotes. That was a mode of thinking that the average person had given up on years ago, because they were all poor. Like it had clearly not worked for them. Mm-hmm. And they think that by that exact same token, we're going to find if we ever went into Iran that there's almost no Muslims outside of like I said, the ruling family, the top military brass and their families, let alone ones who were loyal to the Ayatollah.
Wow.
So no, it's probably the most unique set of circumstances, not just in that region, but of any country in the world, and it's going to be interesting to see what happens with it.
Yeah, I hope it goes a good way. I don't want to say the right way, but
or
a good way.
At least a beneficial way.
Yeah. But, so that sort of gets us heading in the direction for today's topic.
Yeah, it does. I thought it was an interesting lead-in to the topic. Anytime you're dealing with that part of the world, this topic is naturally going to come up, and not necessarily because they're any weirder with how they think about it than we are, because it's probably just that's the perception that the media tries to portray. But,
and it is end times.
Yes, end time prophecies.
Woo, boy, is that a rabbit hole, and very tunnely and holy in more ways than one.
For anybody listening, this show was supposed to be done about 2 weeks ago.
Yep.
But for a couple different personal reasons, we had to push it back to today. And it's almost a good thing we did, because this topic is so intimidating that... Not intimidating in terms of scary or spooky exactly, but intimidating in terms of it's so expansive. It's so long that how do you even begin to really cover it?
Well, exactly. I mean, you could probably teach 2 semesters worth of a college class on this and still
not really even scratch the surface.
Yeah. It's definitely something I have I'll say a passing interest, because it is so, it feels out there in a way, but it is and it's not.
Yeah, I've always had a nerd interest in it.
Yeah.
I told you straight from the get-go, I said, this is a dork topic of mine. But, where do we even start with it? The reason I've always thought this stuff is important, I can't say always, because, I've always had a really nerdy interest in it, in studying it, and, because the way I think a lot of these guys wrote it back in the day was that it was supposed to be like a code, almost like riddles, because when you see at the beginning of the book of Revelation, it says, when it's talking about the number of the beast, says the number of the beast is a human number, and let anybody who can figure it out go for it.
Yeah.
That's me paraphrasing.
Yeah. So let's talk about what there is in the Bible. Okay. So I know there's Daniel.
Well, here was one thing I want to say before going into this is, when I've talked to a couple people online about this subject, people who are atheists, when they hear end time prophecies, they say, well, what's the big deal? How is this something that's relevant to the current times? Isn't this just for, people who sit and obsess over this stuff? And I go, no, it's not at all, because the thing that you don't seem to understand is that whether you believe these things or not is kind of irrelevant, because the people who run the world do. Mm-hmm. And a big part of foreign policy goes towards trying to set the stage up to see them fulfilled, so the rest of you are along for the ride, whether you like it or not.
Interesting.
Have you ever thought about that before?
No, I really haven't. I'm I'm literally like, my brain, it just kind of, I think it cracked. And stuff is oozing out because you of course can't have a self-fulfilling prophecy from millennia ago, but at the same time it has that air of, well, if we do these things, then we can usher this,
we can set the
time
stage
in.
for the return of Jesus, the rebuilding of the temple, whatever you want to have. But like I said, the people who run the world, by and large, absolutely do believe in this stuff. If you go back and look at Reagan's foreign policy or George W. Bush's foreign policy, the bulk of it was set up for this exact reason.
So, do they think that by helping that they're going to be put in charge? What's the end game?
Well, the end game usually is their own. It's not so much personal gain, other than they believe this is what they've been destined to do by being in power through their own conviction or belief in the religion. And one of the things I was saying this past week to a friend of mine who's an atheist, that we were discussing this, is I said, let's say you don't live in America. Let's say you live somewhere where it's more immediate. You might live in Palestine, and you're an atheist. Whether you believe in end-time prophecy or not is irrelevant, because the people around you are trying to set the stage for Armageddon.
Wow.
You have America and America's leaders. You have Israel's leaders. You have Saudi Arabia's leaders. You have Iran's leaders. You're kind of at their mercy.
That's true. And I think that's something that the general person doesn't think about.
No, of course they don't.
Because and I guess why would you, to a point? Because we're so used to, politics is this realm, and but and
religion's another realm. It's a convenience of having an American mind frame where, even though it almost never really truly pans out this way on paper, church and state are separate. But that's such a new way of looking at the world, and by and large, when you're talking about the elite again, a lot of these people are into such weird shit that the average person has no clue.
Yeah.
So anyway, that was me kind of going on a short tirade there. But
it is good to know, hey, pay attention to this kind of stuff, because whether or not we can do anything about it, that probably remains to be seen. But I think it's something that, more people should be aware of.
Right.
The people that, maybe not necessarily that you're electing, but the people that are getting elected, understand what their end goal might be. And, so at least, I don't know, at least we're in the know.
Well, let me ask you this question, starting at the outset. The article I had sent you, I'm not going to dive too deep into it yet, but what were your initial thoughts on it?
I'm
going to on the YouTube video. I'm going to attach a link. To the article.
Yeah. My initial, coming from where I come from in a historical perspective, it felt very anti-Semitic. That was my the first thing that sort of punched me in the face. I was like, okay. But at the same time, I did think, that some of it, I want to say, I guess, made sense to a point.
Yeah.
Because when you look at Reagan and H.W. Bush, there was that mentality.
One of the things I'd always wondered or had a real curiosity as to how it happened was, when you look at the state of the Republican Party, there's always been this view from the outside, I guess, that there was a very anti-Semitic, anti-Israel edge to it, especially in the early days, not the early days, but in the middle part of the last century, where, there was you had Prescott Bush being aligned with Adolf Hitler. You had so many guys like Henry Ford, Walt Disney, that were real admirers of fascism and Nazi Germany. And when you look at the Republican Party now, there's almost this not quite a love but a fetish for Israel. And I'd always wondered how that came about and how it happened. And Reagan was really kind of the turning point, because on a historical timeline, what you had happen was you kind of have to understand the theology that's led us to this point and the way different people have interpreted the Bible. In the 1800s, there was a British theologian who was one of these people who obsessively studied Revelation and somehow didn't end up in a mental institution for it. But he had this idea through combining a lot of different things, like a knowledge of geography, world politics, where different tribes of people who were part of the Bible ended up, and so on. And he came with this idea that Russia was one of the two countries which would be Gog and Magog in the final days, and their role was going to be to attack Israel. Now, in hindsight, it seems pretty clear that he was more influenced by a sense of British supremacy than he was anything, because, for one, Israel didn't exist in the 1850s, and for two, the rulers of Russia were almost to an anal retentive level Christian monarchs. So that's where you first started kind of seeing this mode of thought becoming influential, because even though, looking back on it, it doesn't really add up in a logical sense, this stuff was really popular, influential. I mean, it always is. When you have people coming along in any age who are saying, I figured out end time prophecy, I've cracked the code to be, relevant to current events. And I think maybe on a psychological level, everybody likes thinking that they're that important.
Yeah.
That they have to exist at the end of the world. And then later on, in the late 1800s, you had an Irish preacher who developed this theory that there were going to be two kingdoms in the end of times, that God was going to have an earthly kingdom, which was going to be Israel, and a spiritual kingdom, which was going to be all of Christianity. And so that's where the idea of the rapture comes from, because you really don't find the rapture in Scripture unless you tried to use this idea and apply it to it and say this is what it's talking about.
Really?
Yeah, it's not.
I just assumed it was in there.
No, it's not something that's really spelled out. This is an interpretation that a guy came up with in the late 1800s. But he believed that all the Christians would be raptured up to heaven, and then the final tribulation, I guess, would all center around people who were Jewish by blood and religion, and they would be attacked from all sides, and Jesus would come as a prophesized, military defender or leader of Israel, and then 144,000 of the remaining Jews would, see Jesus as the leader, and then they would accept Christianity. And so that's how, that's how he believed it would be fulfilled. And that guy, in turn, was the teacher of a man named Cyrus Scofield, who wrote the Scofield Reference Bible, which... are you familiar with that one? No,
but it was mentioned in the article, and I'd never heard of it, but...
Yeah, the Scofield Reference Bible is really popular among Pentecostals, among the born-again Christian crowd. Really, a lot of evangelical groups, but it's almost impossible to understate how influential it was, because it was a Bible that in the footnotes section talked about what, pinpoint verses and say, this is what it's talking about. This is, this is what's going on in current times, to give you an explanation. And, that influenced all those guys from Hal Lindsey, who wrote The Late Great Planet Earth. It, Jerry Falwell, Jimmy Swaggart,
Mm-hmm.
Oral Roberts, Billy Graham, everybody.
All the people whose names we know.
Yeah. So, that's kind of where the idea of the rapture comes from, I guess. But there's this prevailing sense of thought that if Israel is God's chosen people, then America is God's almost chosen people, I guess.
Second place trophy?
Yeah. Yeah. Jerry Falwell had this, even though he was within the televangelist community, he was one of the least popular within, among them.
Mm-hmm.
But he was the most influential when it came to American politics. He was buddy with Ronald Reagan, and they used to sit and talk about this stuff all the time. Reagan would plan out a lot of his foreign policy as to some of Falwell's whims. He started these. Do you ever see they'll advertise with Protestant churches? Once a year, a lot of them will say, we're going to take a trip to Israel, do a Holy Land tour.
Mm-hmm. I've heard of that.
That all came from Jerry Falwell, and what those actually were was they weren't sightseeing things. They were Zionist propaganda tours. That it was, they kept everyone away from not just Muslims, but from Palestinian Christians, because they were wanting to say that Palestinians are just all savages. And, they're dead set on marching on Jerusalem, fulfilling the role which we're going to apply to them in Revelation, and we want to show what's the word I would use, the set of words I'd use. They want to show Israel in such a light, or the people there, of saying, we love America so much, you guys are playing our little brother role in the end times, and this has all been ordained. That these Holy Land tours that you see churches take now, they were all part of that.
Wow. So it's almost like if we help you, then maybe in the end times you'll speak up for us. And
and one of the things that talked about in the article that's so interesting is that when you cut away a lot of the BS behind it, or the jargon anyway, is that the implications of what this stuff is saying is that we're going to unleash nuclear war, see untold numbers of people die.
Yeah.
Well over a third of the world, because the 1/3 figure, that's something I can go into later. But that all this death and destruction has to come just so at the end of days there will be a small handful of Jews left who will all basically go, the fulfillment is they're going to get down on their knees, accept Jesus, and say, all of our ancestors were totally wrong about everything. And I mean, could Hitler have been a worse enemy?
God, that's so arrogant. Oh my goodness, so many things.
So anyway,
Phew.
I'd interrupted you a while back, but what were you saying let's back away from this part for a second, and you were, I believe, starting to ask what was in the Bible. You started to say Daniel.
Yeah, so of course, everybody's familiar, or at least has a passing familiarity with the Book of Revelations.
Right.
Whether or not anybody can understand it, which I'm pretty sure nobody can, because it's very strange.
Well, everybody seems to have an idea.
Very true, very true. Yes, I don't know that there's probably a human on Earth, no matter atheist or fundamentalist, whatever it is, you have an opinion on the Book of Revelations.
Do you know the thing I always heard growing up? My father told me was that the mental institution that they have up the street, that he goes, I would be willing to bet that over half the people are there because of the Book of Revelation.
I mean,
because
honestly,
they can't wrap their head around it, and they just have dwelled and dwelled and dwelled on it.
And to me, it had, like, trying to read it, because I've tried. A friend of mine and I in college, I have to say, one night we got a little drunk and we were like, let's figure out the Book of Revelation.
Oh, that's always fun.
Oh man, that was a bananas night.
Well, let me ask you this. I'm not sure if I ever asked you this, but how much of the Bible have you read?
I think I skimmed Genesis, mostly because it was a beget, and a whole bunch of names I couldn't pronounce. I have read some of the Book of Revelation, just, trying to, like, oh, what's all the fuss about?
Yeah.
And, then, like, my eyes go crossed and I think I black out. But yeah, I'm not a very, I was not raised in a biblical type household, and I'm a naturally curious person, so, I'll hear things or, what's this, what are you talking about? But other than that, yeah,
I've read it cover to cover a couple times, and it was pretty recently. Like you said, it wasn't, growing up or anything. It was about 4 years ago, I guess, when I had a class that I had to read the Quran for. And, read it cover to cover, which it's not as long as the Bible. It's really about the size of maybe the Old Testament.
Oh.
Maybe. Or maybe the New Testament, actually. Maybe it's even shorter than that. But it's not very long, lengthy reading, and it's not that intimidating of a book to look at. I mean, even though it can be, I guess. But it's essentially one book from one time period with one author. And that's the way I kind of looked at it at the outset. And, I read it. I really enjoyed it, actually. And then, but when I finished it, I said, I've never read the Bible. And so I just made it my, thing over the next year. I'm somebody, I read about a book a week anyway, but I said with this one, I'm just going to read a little bit every day. Some days I would read an entire book of the Bible, but I said I'm going to take the next year and I'm going to read it front to back, not do the thing where you skip around, because one of the things I've always thought that is kind of maybe not short-sighted or annoying about a lot of Christians is, I came to see pretty early on that I don't think a lot of Christians have actually read the Bible. I think they just hear things from that their Sunday school or their preacher told them growing up, or at best they've memorized a handful of cherry-picked verses here and there. But I've always thought that you can't really do that. That if you want to understand it, you have to read it like you would, a Stephen King novel.
Yeah, any text.
Yeah, any kind of book. You have to approach it like that, because so much of it builds from what was before it. And when I hear somebody quote a Bible verse, I say, can you tell me the verse that comes before that or after it? Or what's its context in the story? Or who's the one actually saying it? Or what are they talking about? Because, if I, like, for example, if I gave you a book the size of it, like Lord of the Rings or Moby Dick or whatever, you wouldn't, say, okay, open up to page 400, go to paragraph 4, sentence 3, read that in a, cherry-picked, like, out of context way and say, well, I understand what the book's talking about. I mean, everybody.
That's such a good point.
Yeah, everybody implicitly understands that with any other book, but for some reason, for the Bible, they don't think of it that way. And so that's the way I looked at it, and I thought the only way I'm ever going to understand the book is if I approach it like that. If I just start out, don't skip around and read it cover to cover.
Because for all intents and purposes, it's literature. It is just like any other book. I mean,
yeah,
on one level.
Well, I think it was about a month ago, maybe, when we were talking about this in a group chat, and I gave like a rundown on it. I took like 30 minutes and just hammered it out. Like, how would you summarize the Bible, like on a basic narrative story? And it's not an easy one. to to summarize, but
Yeah.
it's probably easier than some people think. The well, you said you've read Genesis. That, I mean, lays most of the foundational groundwork for it. Like most all the stories that people hear in Sunday school growing up are from Genesis. You know, you have Adam and Eve, you have Cain and Abel, you have Noah, you have Abraham, and you know he's got 2 sons, Isaac and Ishmael. You have Isaac has 2 sons, Jacob and Esau. You have Joseph being, you know, sold by his brothers into slavery, so they all end up in Egypt, and then 500 years later they're slaves by now, and then Moses comes and liberates them. Then, you know, Moses receives the 10 Commandments, and the, you know, authors Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, even though he dies in the end of Deuteronomy. So it's
Spoiler.
so he probably didn't write all of it. I mean, not to nitpick, but so then after Moses, Joshua comes and picks up for him, and the people for a while are ruled by judges. The most famous of them are probably Deborah, Samson, and Gideon. And the people, however, say we don't want to be ruled by judges, we want to be ruled by kings, like every other nation around us. So God anoints Saul, and then David, and then Solomon. And after Solomon, and David, for example, wrote the book of Psalms, and Solomon wrote Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and probably Song of Solomon. Probably, even though like that's kind of uncertain, that could go either way. But after the death of Solomon, that's where the story gets a lot more complicated, because what was one nation, it splits at this point. You have the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, and the northern kingdom is ruled by Solomon's top general or commander, whose name was Jeroboam. And that was one of the things I forgot to say, is that in Genesis, Jacob, who's Isaac's son, is renamed Israel after he makes a covenant with God, and he has 12 sons. Joseph was one of the brothers, and they become the 12 tribes of Israel. So 10 of the tribes live in the northern kingdom, and in the southern kingdom you have Solomon's son, whose name was Rehoboam, and he rules over the other 2 tribes. So to make a really complicated story short, I guess, you have Israel and Judah becoming intertwined in a number of different world conflicts that went on during the period. Babylon comes in and essentially wipes the 10 tribes from history, although the southern kingdom is left to stay. Then Persia comes in and defeats Babylon, and then you have Alexander the Great come conquer the known world, and the empire's divided up among his generals. Then for a while, control of Palestine by that point comes between both Egypt and Syria, who ruled at varying times. There was a brief independence period under the Maccabees, and then the Roman Empire takes over, which brings you up to Jesus. But in the Bible, there's a number of you have what are called major and minor prophets, and that's really the second half of the entire Old Testament, starting with, you know, after the wisdom books like Song of Solomon and Ecclesiastes, like I said. And major and minor prophets aren't, by denoting them as major or minor, it's not talking about how important they were, it's all by length. So the major prophets are Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, and sometimes Daniel is lumped in, but really those 3. And then you have the minor prophets, who in the Jewish Bible it's just one scroll. It's just called the 12, because they can all comfortably fit on one scroll.
Oh.
But that was the basic rundown I could give the Old Testament. I mean, that's taking a really lengthy narrative and condensing it in a really kindergarten, dumbed down way, but yeah.
Interesting. I don't think I realized a lot of that. But so, how do we get from that to Revelation? Like, how does that...
Are you asking for a New Testament rundown? The rundown of the New Testament, since we're already like going this route, the four Gospels are different accounts by four different authors of the life of Jesus, and they all roughly cover a similar set of events, but the authors who wrote them all clearly had different motivations for writing. For example, Matthew, the book of Matthew is the most commented upon or written about book in the entire Bible. And the reason for it is because Matthew was interested in using the story of Christ to sell to religiously observant Jews, because the entire narrative of Matthew, when you read it, it's set up in harking back to prophecies from the Old Testament, from a number of prophets saying Jesus fulfilled this. Jesus must be the Messiah because this, and this, so on. Mark is more interested in like the human side or the suffering aspect. Luke is more interested in the charitable side of Jesus, like for example, healing the sick, the things he did for poor people, etc. Which, if I remember right, Luke, the way the common interpretation is that Luke was a doctor, and so makes sense, I guess. Mark, the author of Mark, they still don't even know who that was. They just still say the author referred to as Mark wrote this. So, but John, for example, really isn't interested in any of that. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are all very similar to each other, which is why they're called the Synoptic Gospels, but John really isn't similar to any of them. John is pretty much exclusively just interested in the idea of Jesus as God incarnate, to the point he only appeared to be human. It's entirely interested in like this, not a cult, but this entire like mystic or supernatural nature of Jesus, I guess. So the four Gospels like all cover that, and when you read them, it's supposed to give the impression that Jesus was all of these things to all these writers, so it gives a composite picture, I guess. Then you have Acts, which is the story of what happened to the disciples and apostles after Jesus' death, where they traveled to, where they preached, so on. And then you run into a figure named Paul, which I thought was really interesting when I read the Bible for the first time, to realize that in the New Testament, Jesus isn't the true main character of the New Testament. The true main character is a guy named Paul, who was from the area that's now Turkey, or Anatolia. Probably by blood, I mean, this was before the Turks were present in Anatolia, so by blood he would have been, he probably would have been a Greek, even though he was a Roman citizen and a Jew by religion. It's probably a subject we'll go into later, but the terminology used in the old days of what constituted a Roman were a lot muddier than other ones. Have we ever talked about this before?
I feel like we have, at least, because I feel like I discussed that recently with somebody, that it wasn't necessarily a geographical thing. Right. Because they were kind of, it was everywhere, but it wasn't.
The easiest way I could explain it is that back in those days, if somebody was written about and they were referred to as a Spartan or a Macedonian or Athenian or something like that, for example, there were all kinds of things you could surmise about that person by that descriptor. Like, you could also imply what ethnicity they were, what religion they were, what their form of government was, so on, like that. Just by going back and reading history and looking about the civilization. Rome wasn't really like that, though. Rome was an entirely political construct that was based on two things, conquest and taxation. Wherever they would conquer became Rome, in air quotes. one of their big qualities was going places and conquering, but propping up puppet rulers and letting people keep their traditions and religions, and allowing one of the locals to rule over them, because it made insurrection that much less likely.
Mm-hmm.
But generally, anybody who paid taxes to Caesar was called a Roman. So a lot of times in the New Testament, when they talk about somebody being a Roman, they're not talking about them being an Italian. They're talking about them being a Jew who paid taxes to Caesar.
Mm-hmm. A Roman citizen versus a true Italian Roman.
Right.
Yeah.
And say, like, with Rome as a political construct, it was barely even based in the city of Rome, except at the very beginning. It later became Constantinople,
mm-hmm.
and then later the Ottoman Empire and present-day Turkey, which, that's one that we'll probably get into later on. But yeah, Rome was really different from the way a lot of people understand, because like I said, if we were talking about somebody being a Spartan, you knew they lived in Sparta.
Mm-hmm.
You knew all kinds of things about them just by that descriptor alone. But Rome, calling somebody a Roman really wasn't like that. And there were a number of other figures in the Bible who were like that, like, just sticking with the New Testament, for example, another figure would be King Herod, the one who they talk about, trying to kill baby Jesus, the stories in church. Well, Herod was somebody who was a Roman, but he was also religiously he was a Jew. So politically he was a Roman, religiously he was a Jew, but ethnically he's what we would now call an Arab. So the lines of descriptions in that time period were really muddy,
mm-hmm.
like I said. So the main figure in the New Testament is a guy named Paul, who, the story goes, was a religiously observant Jew who took a lot of, arrogant pride, I guess, in persecuting Christians. But he's on the road to Damascus one day and gets blinded. There's just a glow of light where he never sees Jesus, but he hears a voice telling him, stop persecuting my followers, and basically saying, I want you to be my messenger to the Gentiles. So he writes all these. The rest of the New Testament is filled out with what are called epistles, but they're letters
mm-hmm.
that Paul wrote, in some cases to other disciples, in a lot of cases to churches and other places, like, all the books you've heard, like Romans would be like a letter to the Romans, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, so on. Those were all letters written to different church communities. So the epistles make up the bulk of the New Testament by a large margin, and then the final one is Revelation, which was written by John, which is believed to be the same John who wrote the Gospel of John. But this is decades and decades later, when he's being held in captivity, and beyond that, there's not a lot that people know. In some interpretations, this was a dream that he had. In others, this was a vision that he saw, clear as day, in like a mystic sense or something.
Mm-hmm.
But that's kind of how you arrive at it.
Interesting. I mean, it's quite the way to end things.
In the story.
yeah. It's like, here's the whole story, and by the way, here's some weirdness.
Yeah.
And we're just gonna kind of leave that hanging, because
right.
Because I mean, there is so much to unpack.
Yeah.
In Revelation, and that's just dealing with one religious aspect of end time prophecy.
Right.
To me, Revelation has always sort of had a Nostradamus kind of feel.
Right.
Where it's like, I'm going to talk in riddles, and you're not going to know what I'm saying, so that basically you can make it anything you want.
Well, the problem I've always had with Nostradamus and Thunderpud number 2, who's sadly not present today, and I had talked about on a past show, was that the subject of Nostradamus came up, and the opinion I've always had of him is, I think the story we were telling is that I can remember when Y2K there was the build up to it, and there was a big commercial cash grab.
Very much.
Going on.
I remember that.
Yeah, really similar to like with 2012 a couple years ago. Well, I can remember being in a bookstore at the mall back when I was a teenager, and on a front table they had a book of Nostradamus prophecies, and some author had edited them into like a month by month thing, so that you could look up what year you were in, and it would say, for this month, this is what Nostradamus says. And this was in I believe this was 1999. I think I could be wrong, but the prophecy for June, which was that month I was looking at, said the uncrowned son of the king will fall from the sky and the world will mourn. And that was the same month when John F. Kennedy Jr.'s plane crashed. And we were laughing about that, and I'm like, to some people, maybe he was the uncrowned son of the king, but I think to the majority of everybody, he was just some dude. I mean, I know that's a story that, housewives who read a lot of Reader's Digest, or people who gorge on A&E or something, like to believe that the Kennedys are America's royal family, but they're really just people.
Yeah. They just happen to have a lot of hands in politics.
And anyway, celebrities are royalty. Not
yes.
the Kennedys.
God knows.
But the thing I was getting to about Nostradamus prophecies is you can't predict anything to them if you actually read them. There are things that are so they're so unclear and so
opaque or oblique.
Yeah, I was about to say, is oblique the word you'd use, where you can only really apply them to things in hindsight.
Yes.
I mean, there's nothing in them that's clear about anything, but it's just things where, you can look back on the month, like read back in history and go, maybe it was
exactly
talking about that.
Exactly. And that's something, you could never use it to predict when the world is going to end, or when World War III is going to start, or any of that, because there's nothing. You can read it, and you can read a million things into the same train, but what are you going to do? I mean, you don't know if you're right. You don't. There's nothing to really go on. But after it's happened, you can say, "Oh shit, this meant." Well, when you read these things, then that's totally this. Okay, I mean, I guarantee you could probably go pick up another book and find something that correlates to today, written 700 years ago. Because
isn't that like, back around Y2K time, the idea of the Bible code became really big. Do you remember that?
Oh yes. In fact, I think I have that book, or I had.
Do you
book.
really?
Uh-huh.
I've never bothered to sit down and look at it, but the way like, for example, they'll say that based on using a code, you can go through it and say, okay, every 50 letters, it says this in this book, or so on and so on, and you'll end up with things like I remember one that I saw examples of that made me chuckle. It said Koresh the liar, like David Koresh, and I just thought to myself, if I'm talking about like things every 50 letters, and then every 35 letters, and then up and down or diagonal, you can find anything you want.
Exactly. And that was my takeaway.
Of any book of that size.
Exactly. Grab the dictionary. You can probably do it too.
Yeah.
I
could probably go through damn War and Peace and circle random things on pages and words and come up with Romeo and Juliet.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that was my basic takeaway, because it was one of those things, I'm just a curious person. You give me something and I'm gonna go, oh, okay, well, I will give you your chance.
Yeah.
And I remember, thinking the same thing. I was like, well, you haven't stumbled upon anything. You've basically found what you wanted to find.
Right.
And that, to me, the same thing with Nostradamus. And to a point, the same thing with Revelation. You'll see whatever you want to see in it. Mm-hmm. It's not a blueprint. It's not a, well, we're going to go from point A to point B, and then, this is going to happen, and then you'll see this. No, it's just random, wacky shit. And here, put your spin on it. Because 5 people could put 5 different spins on it, and they could all be right, they could all be wrong. It just, and in the grand scheme of things, it doesn't matter to the normal person.
Mm-hmm.
But, if your goal is to make something happen, then yeah, it's
absolutely. So, the number of the beast.
Yes.
Now we're getting into good territory. 666, even though in some uncovered writings on archaeological digs, they say it's 616. So,
interesting. I'd not heard that.
What do you know about it?
The omen.
But yeah, I was just about to say besides the omen.
Oh, besides that, 666. That's, I don't know, is Satan's number or something.
Well, in Revelation, it's called the number of the beast.
Yeah.
But
I always assumed Satan was the beast.
When you go back and look at the historical context, the time it was written, it actually means Emperor Nero, or Nero Caesar in some translations. Because during that period of time in Rome, numbers were frequently used to substitute for letters in writing. And yeah, 666 means Nero Caesar.
Well, that makes a little more sense.
Yeah. Well, it says it's a human number. It's almost like you could think of Revelation like a political cartoon.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, that's so. I mean, aside from, say, representing Nero or the Beast, what does it mean? What's its significance?
Well, its significance is the way I interpret Revelation myself, and this is after reading it numerous times, is that what it's referring to is the fall of Rome.
Okay.
I think. Gosh, this one's a little complicated to go into, but most people naturally assume when they read Revelation that this is the end of the world it's talking about, which it definitely can. It's a book that's so wide open that it can mean almost whatever you want it to mean. Does that make sense? Like, one of the things that I think is so interesting and different between Christian and Muslim end-time prophecy is that Christian end-time prophecy is really not clear at all. It's something that is so shrouded and clouded with metaphor that there's never been an age where people haven't tried to apply it to current events. And it's the reason why people argue about it so much, because it's so unclear, like I said, as to what it really means.
Yeah.
Muslim end-time prophecy isn't like that.
No. Just from the reading that I've done, it is very different.
It is very specific.
Yeah, sometimes a little bananas, but yes.
To an almost creepy degree in a lot of ways.
Oh, yes.
Like, I'm trying to think but before going into that, one of the questions that I had for you is, when we first started talking about the article at the beginning of the show, you said it seemed a bit on the anti-Semitic side. I was going to see if you could elaborate on that a little bit.
For me, the author just almost to a point kind of seemed to come at it from, these people are, pro-Zionist is the phrase that was really used.
Yeah.
And it was almost like, and here's why that's a bad thing. It was putting a I can't think of the, like a detrimental spin, or like a, here's why they're wrong, or here's why this is a bad idea.
Right. Well, there's a number of quotations that the article contains, like when these are all quotes that were given. I mean, it's not one that they publicized super heavily that they had said, but by different televangelists back at this point in time in the 80s, like James Robson. What was the name of the group he was the head of? Something about Focus on the Family, or it was something like that.
Yeah,
I can't remember the name of the group he was the head of, but either way, that was him. He had a quote where he says, "There will be no peace until Jesus comes. Any preaching of peace prior to his return is heresy. It's against the word of God. It's antichrist." You have.
Which that doesn't even make any sense.
Well, Jerry Falwell actually had a more famous quote that, Jerry Falwell said Jesus was not a pacifist, he was not a sissy.
Yeah.
Do you remember that one?
And that one, that's... Because, I could probably support both sides of that argument, because I think you can support both sides of that argument with things from the New Testament.
Well, here was some of the others. You have a quote of Ronald Reagan speaking to Jerry Falwell. He says, "Jerry, I sometimes believe that we're heading very fast for Armageddon right now." And Ronald Reagan in 1980 says, "Israel is the only stable democracy we can rely on as a spot where Armageddon could come." Then you have a guy who was Israeli, who's named Rabbi Moshe Levinger, who was one of the terrorists who attempted to blow up the Dome of the Rock mosque, where the way he quoted it, and he said, "Zionism is mysticism. Zionism will wither away if you cut it from its mystical messianic roots. Zionism is a movement that does not think in rational terms, but in terms of divine commandments. What matters only is God's promise to Abraham is recorded in the book of Genesis." And another rabbi was quoted saying, "We should not forget that the supreme purpose of the ingathering of exiles and the establishment of our state is the building of the temple. The temple is the very top of our pyramid." And there's this idea, I've always joked about this, how if you spend any time hanging around people who are doomsday preppers, survivalists, things like that, which I have. I know a lot of these guys, but there's a joke that Jason and I have always had, that you learn pretty quickly that when they're always throwing around the word globalist, that the globalists are the enemies, that usually that's a code word for Jew in a lot of those circles. And Zionist is another one that kind of fills that role as well, because it's a more polite way of saying Jew. So the term Zionist has its own problematic connotations in a lot of ways when discussing this stuff, because it's so easy to look at and say, okay, this is just strictly anti-Semitic material. But one of the main perceptions that a lot of people on that end of the spectrum have is that there's like a shadow government ruling America, where the Jews are the ones who really run the show in Washington, and so on and so on. And the thing I would use is I would use this as almost a counter argument to that, is that there's a lot of things I understand. I get that maybe in Washington the Israeli lobby is pretty oversized compared to some of the other countries, and that we seem to have a lot of vested interest in foreign policy that doesn't necessarily help us. It's more beneficial for Israel than anything. But the reality of it is that Jewish people in Washington are really outnumbered by 50 to 1 by people who are white Christians who believe this stuff. It's not so much that this stuff is coming from this shadow government of Jewish people. It's people like Ronald Reagan, like Jerry Falwell, like Pat Robertson, so on, who believe that America's role is to be Israel's little brother figure in the end times. That, do you understand what I mean by that?
Yeah.
Yeah, I would almost use that as like a counter argument to any of that. That those guys far and away outnumber any Jewish people in Washington or anywhere.
Yeah. And that especially over here, that makes sense.
Yeah. But no, I mean, it's not just Washington. Like, I mean, any churches, like in this area, I mean, that's a mode of thought that's heavy, that America has a definite role to fulfill in the end times. And it's, like I said, it's Israel's, scrappy little brother, or the muscular one or something.
Yeah. We're the protector.
Yeah.
So that we can fulfill that prophecy.
Right.
Huh.
Well, I think we're at a point right now where I think we can sort of transition. Let's take a
I think
break for a bit.
What we're gonna move to, starting with this topic, is we're gonna break things up.
Right.
So we're gonna kind of leave you hanging a little bit.
As to what we're talking about.
yeah, just a little bit. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and sign off for this week, and we will be back in 2 weeks.
Boom.
For the conclusion of End Times Prophecy.
Part 2.
Hold on to your seats.
This is a test of the emergency broadcast system. The broadcasters of your area, in voluntary cooperation with the FCC and other authorities, have developed this system to keep you informed in the event of an emergency. If this had been an actual emergency, you would have been instructed where to tune in your area for news and official information. This concludes this test of the emergency broadcast system.